The jungle felt alive, alive in the way that made every sound unnervingly real. A crack of a branch snapping in the distance. The rustle of leaves just beyond the line of sight. The steady hum of insects, their wings like whispers in the humid air. And somewhere, deeper in the shadows, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, fast, deliberate, and closing in. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest as she sprinted through the underbrush, her breath shallow, and the weight of the camera she clutched at her side the only thing grounding her. Every step felt like it could be her last. Behind her, the sound of pursuing feet was relentless, a cacophony of heavy boots crashing through the dense jungle floor. She had to get to the river. That was the only thought running through her mind. Her brother Danny's disappearance weighed heavily on her thoughts, but right now, survival came first. Sophia glanced over her shoulder, sweat dripping from her brow as her dark hair clung to her neck. The figure of a man, a soldier, was barely visible through the haze of trees and vines. His silhouette was blurred, but the distinct shape of a rifle slung across his back was unmistakable. "Keep going." Malik's voice cut through the noise, a strange shout that snapped Sophia back to the present. His voice had a rough edge to it now, the kind that came with exhaustion and fear. The soldier was closing in on them, and he wasn't the only one. There were others. The rebels were everywhere. Malik's heavy boots crushed the leaves beneath him as he pushed ahead, keeping pace with her. His face, always stoic and composed, was now set in a grim mask. His eyes flicked nervously around them, scanning for threats. Sophia knew that, like her, he was struggling to keep calm. They were out of time. If they didn't find cover soon, they'd be sitting ducks. The jungle around them closed in, a suffocating green blur. Every direction was the same, a maze of towering trees, thick vines, and undergrowth so dense that they could barely see the path ahead. The air felt thick and oppressive, clinging to their skin like a second layer. It was hard to focus, harder still to breathe. "I don't know how much farther I can go," Sophia gasped, her legs burning from the constant sprint. Her lungs ached as if they were on fire, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She had seen what would happen to people who stopped running. "We're close," Malik said, his voice tight. "Just a little farther." Sophia nodded, but doubt began to settle in the pit of her stomach. Could they really make it? Would the river offer them an escape, or would it become just another trap? The jungle was its own labyrinth, and in this war-torn land, survival was a game that changed every minute. As they ran, Sophia caught sight of a familiar landmark, a towering rock formation on the left, a half-hidden outpost behind it. Her brother had passed through this area on his last assignment. It was a place of refuge for journalists and aid workers, an old, forgotten compound abandoned after the latest wave of violence. Danny had been here. He had sent a message from this exact spot just days before he disappeared. But now it was a death trap. Before she could warn Malik, a shot rang out. The crack of a rifle tore through the air, followed by another, then another. The sharp sound of bullets ripping through the thick foliage was unmistakable. "Get down," Malik shouted, pushing Sophia behind a nearby cluster of trees. They huddled together, crouching low, as the gunfire continued. Bullets zipped past them, barely missing their heads. The jungle, once a refuge, now felt like an unforgiving predator. Each step could be their last. Sophia's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the tree, the rough bark digging into her back. She dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly. It was then she saw them, the rebels. Two men emerged from the trees, rifles aimed straight ahead. They were scanning the area, their eyes scanning every corner of the jungle, the barrels of their guns swinging in synchronized precision. "They'll find us," Sophia whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. "We need to move." Malik was already on it. His eyes flicked around, calculating the best route. His hand gripped the knife at his side as he prepared to take action. He was a former soldier, trained for moments like this, but Sophia had seen firsthand how easily a well-planned escape could be undone by a single misstep. "We move on 3, Malik whispered. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, a new voice broke through the air, coming from a different direction. "Hold it right there," a man's voice barked. This voice, deeper and colder than the others, was accompanied by the unmistakable sound of boots crushing through the underbrush, faster than before. Sophia froze, panic surging through her veins as she realized that they were surrounded. Her options were dwindling fast. She could feel her pulse in her temples as she fought to steady her breathing. "Move now." Malik's command was sharp, and they both bolted from their hiding spot, racing toward the only possible escape, the rock formation in the distance. They couldn't afford to stay hidden. The rebels knew where they were now. The sound of pursuit grew louder, the crunch of leaves and the snap of branches echoing through the jungle. Their legs burned as they sprinted toward the outpost, but the sound of the rebels' footsteps was growing too close. They weren't going to make it. The river seemed impossibly far away now. But then, the faintest glimmer of hope flickered in the distance. "I see it," Malik said, his voice urgent. "The outpost is up ahead. We can take cover there. It's the only chance we've got." Sophia's breath hitched. The outpost, was it really their salvation, or would it turn out to be another deadly dead end? But there was no choice. They had to take the chance. Malik reached for her arm, pulling her toward the outpost as the sounds of their pursuers grew even louder. The air was thick with the tension of impending danger, and Sophia could only focus on one thing now: survival. The outpost loomed in front of them, a crumbling structure barely standing after years of neglect and the ravages of war. Once, it might have been a place of hope for journalists and aid workers, but now it seemed more like a tomb, a hollow reminder of everything that had been lost. Its weathered walls and shattered windows told the story of a place abandoned too soon. "Get inside," Malik hissed, his voice tight with urgency. They had reached the old compound, but the risk wasn't over. They had to make it past the ruins and find shelter. Safety was still far from guaranteed. The jungle's oppressive heat pressed down on them, adding to the suffocating tension. Sophia's legs were like lead, each step a battle against exhaustion. Her breath came in short gasps as her eyes darted around, always alert to any movement, any sound. She could hear the rebels' voices now, their harsh, guttural words cutting through the air. They were closing in fast. "I need a moment," she whispered, reaching for her water bottle and taking a long, desperate drink. Malik was already inside the compound, crouched low and surveying their surroundings with military precision. "Stay alert," he ordered. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they catch up." Sophia nodded, swallowing hard. Time was slipping away. She had to make it to the next step. She had to find Danny. Her thoughts flitted back to her brother. She had been carrying his memory like a weight around her neck, and with every passing day, the hope of finding him alive felt more like a fading dream. Was he still out there? Was he somewhere in this war-torn jungle, fighting for survival just like she was? Or had the chaos swallowed him whole, as it had so many others? She shook her head, focusing on the task at hand. There was no time for doubt. She had come too far. "Malik," she whispered urgently, slipping inside the crumbling walls of the outpost. "I heard them. They're getting closer. We can't stay here long." Malik's eyes flicked to the door, then to the shadows beyond the broken windows. "I know, but we need information. We need to find out where they're taking the prisoners. We can't just run." Sophia's stomach twisted. "And if we can't find that out, what then?" "Then we make a break for it," Malik said, his voice cold and determined. "But we don't leave empty-handed." Sophia could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. He wasn't just focused on surviving, he was focused on gathering intel, on winning the war. But this wasn't his fight. This was hers. She didn't care about the bigger picture. She cared about Danny. They crept deeper into the building, stepping cautiously through the broken door and into the dimly lit hallway. The dust and decay made the place feel as if it had been abandoned for years. But Sophia knew better. The signs of recent activity were everywhere. The fresh footprints in the dirt, the broken radio equipment still crackling faintly, the abandoned chairs and overturned tables. "This way," Malik motioned, pointing down a narrow corridor. He moved with the quiet precision of someone who had spent too much time in the war zones. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning for danger. Sophia followed close behind, her senses heightened. Every creak of the building, every distant shout outside, made her heart race. They reached the end of the corridor, where a rusted metal door stood half open, leading into a small storage room. Malik pushed it open cautiously, and they both slipped inside. The room was cluttered with supplies, old crates, abandoned weapons, boxes of food, and medical supplies. But what caught Sophia's attention was the map pinned to the wall. It was large, hand-drawn, and covered in markings, coordinates, locations of rebel bases, and arrows pointing in various directions. "This is it," Malik muttered, moving closer to the map. "This is where they're keeping prisoners." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the map quickly. Her finger traced over the marks, lines that led to a location deep in the jungle. It was a place she recognized, a village where Danny had been conducting interviews just days before he went missing. "That's it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's where they have him. We can get to him." Malik didn't reply. He was already studying the map, plotting their next move. Sophia couldn't wait any longer. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to grab his arm. "We need to go now. No more wasting time." Malik's eyes met hers, the cold resolve still evident in his gaze. "You're right. But we'll need to move fast. If we're lucky, we'll catch them off guard." Just as Malik turned to leave the room, a sound caught their attention, a distant thud, followed by shuffling footsteps. The rebels were getting closer. Too close. Malik motioned for Sophia to follow him as he ducked into the shadows of the hallway, and she obeyed without question. They moved quickly, keeping low, their bodies pressed against the walls as they navigated through the compound. But as they neared the exit, a voice called out sharply from behind them. "Stop right there." Malik froze, and Sophia's heart stuttered in her chest. The rebels had found them. She could hear the scuffle of boots on the floor and the sharp click of a rifle's safety being released. Before she could react, Malik spun around, his body tense with fury. "Run," he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back door of the compound. The jungle was their only escape now, but even that didn't guarantee safety. The rebels would follow, there was no getting around that. Sophia pushed herself harder, her mind focused only on one thing: the map, the village, and her brother. She had to find him before it was too late. The danger was real. The stakes had never been higher. And with each step, the fear gnawed at her soul. Would they make it out alive? Or would this jungle, with its twisted roots and hidden traps, become their grave? The jungle swallowed them whole. As they dashed through the dense undergrowth, the world around them seemed to close in. The trees, with their towering trunks and gnarled branches, pressed in on them like silent observers of their desperate flight. The thick foliage made it difficult to see, but the sound of the rebels' pursuit was unmistakable, a constant, oppressive rhythm that echoed through the jungle like the beat of a drum. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest as she pushed through the tangled vines and sharp thorns that seemed to catch at her every movement. She had no time to think, no time to question whether they would survive. There was only forward, one foot in front of the other, despite the exhaustion that clawed at her body, despite the fear that gripped her every thought. Beside her, Malik moved with fluid precision, his eyes scanning the path ahead. His military training was evident in the way he navigated the jungle, his movements calculated and purposeful. But even he was beginning to show signs of fatigue, sweat slicking his brow and his breathing heavier as the distance between them and their pursuers narrowed. "We need to find higher ground," Malik grunted, his voice barely audible over the roar of their frantic escape. Sophia nodded without speaking, her mind focused solely on keeping up. They had been running for what felt like hours, with no sign of slowing down. The distant sounds of the rebels were still there, growing louder with every passing moment. They reached a small clearing, the canopy above thinning just enough to let some light filter through. Malik stopped abruptly, his hand raising in a silent signal for Sophia to halt. She skidded to a stop beside him, trying to catch her breath as she glanced around nervously. "Up there," Malik said quietly, pointing toward a ridge that rose steeply ahead. It was the only option, and there was no time to waste. Without hesitation, they made their way toward the ridge, scrambling up the steep incline as best as they could. The earth beneath their hands and feet was soft and slick with moisture, and the climb was harder than it seemed, but they had no choice. The rebels were closing in. At the top of the ridge, Malik paused again, his eyes scanning the jungle below them. They could see nothing but the thick, oppressive green of the jungle's heart. But he knew they weren't alone. "I think we lost them," Malik said after a long pause. He dropped to a crouch, motioning for Sophia to do the same. For now, Sophia slumped against a tree, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building up since they first started running. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she didn't care. She was too tired to care. "What now?" she asked breathlessly, her voice hoarse with the effort of their escape. "We rest," Malik replied, his voice tight with fatigue. "We wait for nightfall. Then we make our move." Sophia glanced over at him, her mind racing. Every minute they stayed here, exposed on this ridge, was another minute the rebels had to catch up with them. She didn't trust that they'd be safe, even here, high above the jungle floor. "But we need to move. If we wait, we risk being caught in the open," she protested. Malik shook his head. "We don't have a choice. If we keep running, we'll burn out. We need to gather our strength, make sure we're ready to move when it's dark. It's our only chance." Sophia bit her lip, her gaze falling to the dense jungle below. She couldn't argue with him. They had to take every advantage they could. And right now, nightfall was their best chance. Hours passed in silence, the only sounds the distant calls of animals and the occasional rustling of the trees. The heat of the day began to wane, and the air grew cooler, but that didn't offer much relief. Anxiety gnawed at Sophia, and her thoughts turned once again to her brother. Danny had been caught in this hell, and she couldn't afford to be weak, not now. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows of the jungle grew longer, stretching across the land like a blanket of darkness. It was time to move. Malik stood up, his movements swift and deliberate. "We go now," he said, his voice low. "Stay close." Sophia pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling with fatigue. The jungle below them had gone silent, and the rebels had likely retreated to regroup. But that didn't mean they were safe. The danger was still very real. She could feel it in the air, the tense stillness that gripped everything around them. Together, they moved silently down the ridge, slipping into the shadows of the jungle once more. The cover of night had arrived, and with it, the feeling of being swallowed whole by the dense forest. They were invisible now, at least to the naked eye, but Sophia knew the rebels wouldn't be far behind. They had to be careful, every step, every breath. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting pale shadows across the path as they made their way deeper into the jungle. They were close now, close to the village where Danny had been last seen. The map Malik had found in the compound was clear. It led them straight to the heart of rebel territory, where the prisoners were held. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The path to the village was littered with dangers, and the closer they got, the more exposed they would become. A sudden rustle in the bushes ahead snapped Sophia out of her thoughts. Malik's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Stay low," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sophia crouched low, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound grew louder, closer. Someone or something was moving through the jungle. Her breath caught in her throat as the bushes parted, revealing the shape of a figure, a rebel soldier, armed and on alert. They were so close. Too close. The moonlight bathed the jungle in an eerie glow as the rebel soldier drew nearer, the faint rustling of his steps growing louder, more distinct. The air seemed to thicken with tension, each second stretching into eternity. Sophia held her breath, praying he wouldn't spot them, praying that the shadows would be enough to conceal their presence. Malik was the first to react. With the quiet efficiency that only years of training could instill, he slid to the ground, pulling Sophia down with him. The The soldier's boots crunched softly on the earth, and he paused, as though sensing something in the air. Time seemed to freeze. Sophia's heart raced in her chest. She could feel the soldier's presence looming just a few feet away, his gun resting loosely in his hands. Her body tensed, her mind screaming for her to move, to do something, anything. But she knew that even the slightest motion could give them away. Seconds passed. Then, the soldier shifted, his attention drifting away as he continued his patrol. It was a narrow escape, but it was enough. Sophia and Malik didn't move until he was completely out of earshot. They remained crouched in the underbrush, their bodies rigid with the effort of staying still. Finally, Malik gave a subtle nod, signaling that it was time to move. Slowly, carefully, they crept forward, back on their path toward the village. Every step felt heavier now, as if the weight of their survival was bearing down on them. But their goal was so close, just ahead, through the dense jungle, the village where Danny might still be alive, where they could finally have a chance to end this nightmare. They pressed on, the jungle now seeming more hostile than ever, its very branches seeming to reach out and snag at their clothes. They moved with purpose, but the silence was broken by the distant sound of footsteps. Footsteps that did not belong to them. Sophia froze. The rebels were closer than ever. They had found their trail. "Malik," she whispered urgently, "they're on our heels." Malik's eyes flicked to hers. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the decision that flashed across his face. They couldn't outrun them. Not anymore. They had to face the danger head-on. "Get to the village," he said, his voice low but determined. "I'll handle them." Sophia's heart skipped a beat.
"What?"
"No, you can't. Go," he hissed, his face hard with resolve. "This is our only chance." He didn't wait for her response. Malik moved swiftly, melting into the shadows, disappearing into the underbrush. Sophia felt a pang of fear in her chest, but she knew what had to be done. She had to get to Danny, no matter the cost. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. The jungle had become their battleground, and it seemed as though the stakes were higher than ever. But she couldn't look back.
Not now.
The village was close. She could feel it. As the night deepened, Sophia's feet began to ache, her body nearly spent from the relentless pace and the constant fear that had driven them forward. The rebels had followed them for miles, and every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind, sent her heart into a frenzy. But then she saw it. In the distance, through the trees, the flickering of lights. The village. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the exhaustion, the thirst, the overwhelming desire to collapse. There was no time for weakness now. She had come too far. Danny was out there, and she wasn't leaving without him. She reached the edge of the village just as the first signs of dawn began to break. The low hum of the jungle was replaced by the faint murmurs of people stirring. She ducked behind a hut, peering out carefully to survey the area. There were a few soldiers patrolling the outskirts of the village. She could hear their voices drifting through the air, but they were too focused on their tasks to notice her approach. It was then that she spotted something that made her blood run cold. Through the open door of a small building near the center of the village, she saw a group of prisoners, men and women, their faces haggard and worn. Among them was a familiar face, Danny. Sophia's heart surged. Her brother. He was alive. But there was no time to celebrate. The soldiers were just ahead, and she could see two of them walking toward the building where the prisoners were held. They had to act, and fast. Sophia's mind raced. She couldn't just rush in and hope for the best.
No.
She needed a plan. "Malik," she whispered into her radio, her voice barely above a breath. "I found him. He's alive, but we have company. There are too many soldiers. I need a diversion." A crackling sound came through the earpiece, followed by Malik's voice, low and steady. "I'm in position. I'll give you 5 minutes. Get to him." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the area, searching for a way in. She noticed a small gap in the fence near the back of the building, just large enough for her to slip through. It was risky, but it was the only option. She didn't hesitate. The moment Malik created the diversion, she would move. The diversion came suddenly, a loud explosion in the distance, followed by the chaos of shouting voices and frantic movements. The soldiers around the village scattered, rushing to the source of the disturbance. Sophia didn't waste a second. She moved like a shadow, slipping through the gap in the fence and darting toward the building. Her heart raced as she neared the door, her hands trembling with anticipation. She pushed the door open slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she slipped inside. And there he was.
Danny.
He looked up as she stepped into the dimly lit room. His eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice hoarse, filled with a mix of relief and shock. "Don't speak," she said urgently, rushing to his side. "We don't have much time." Together, they freed the other prisoners, moving quickly and quietly, her hands shaking as she worked to undo the ropes binding them. The sounds of chaos outside grew louder, but Sophia knew they were running out of time. Finally, the last prisoner was freed. They had done it. Sophia turned to Danny, her heart full of emotion. "Let's go," she said, her voice strong despite the fear that still gripped her. As they moved toward the back of the building, the first signs of daylight broke through the jungle, casting long shadows across the ground. They had made it, but the fight wasn't over. There were still more dangers ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. Together, they could survive. And nothing, no rebel, no jungle, no enemy, could take that away. Sophia and Danny eventually made it out of the jungle, their journey marked by the scars of survival and the bond of family that had kept them going. They emerged from the chaos changed, but stronger. And though they knew the world they had left behind was forever altered, they had learned the true meaning of resilience and courage. The journey had been long. The fight had been fierce. But they were alive. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.